All right. Hello. Good morning. Finally, in since 10th of October, there's not been a single normal day. Like, one of us has been sick. It's been insane. This is the first day. Well, my partner is still sick, but that's fine. uh, it's been crazy. And I've been feeling so demotivated because I've been pulled away from work, feeling really, really bad. Um, Leaving not helping out, like helping the team, blocking the project we're working on to some extent. It's just been really, really bad. And then I got like super demotivated. Like I didn't even want to go back to work at some point. But I woke up this morning like feeling good about things again. It's almost like you get oh, I need to change my glasses. It's almost like you get I've had this happen to me before. Like I lived very isolated, and you develop this like social anxiety, and you can do that in your own home with the family because you're just stuck inside, right? And your like environment is so isolated, and then with the dark and the bad weather, and it just becomes this like, yeah. But the thing that's kept me going is this thing we're talking about here, which is RASK. And I'm so pumped about this logo. It looks amazing. And this is a GPT that did its magic with some guidance from me. But yeah, it's really, really awesome. And the whole point of this is that, like, through my career, I've only been building single page applications, and all these other frameworks like React and Svelte and Solid, and everyone's like going server side rendering and all of this stuff. And I haven't built applications that need that. It's all about like the experience of developing, like especially the complexity of the state management. That's been kind of the most important thing. But then I've had like all these good parts from React. It's been like awesome to work on, like expressing UI, like having this reconciliation where you can use if statements and map over arrays and all of this stuff. Like being able to express UIs that way has been amazing. But then I've had such a horrible time with the state management and always feel like I'm doing something React doesn't want me to do. But then I also had this great experience with like MobX and like the state management tools I built myself, but it's always like kind of wrapped around React, which doesn't want me to do these things. So that's what RASK is. It's like it's taking the really good ideas from React, so it feels like React, but it doesn't have the state management inside the reconciler. And the way it does it is just separating them. So a component has two scopes. It has the setup scope, and then it returns a function, which is the render scope. And that's it. You still have functions that just returns UI, but those are stateless components. And then what I've been working on that hasn't been released yet is the asynchronous story, because this is also really, really difficult to do. And it was really good timing, I think, because one thing is like expressing the state of something asynchronous in the UI, which is like, how do you make, how can you consume a promise, right? And you can consume a promise quite easily by giving it state, like you give it like an is pending state, a value, an error, and all of this stuff. But that's not enough, right? Because you also want to be able to express doing something async. And there are like two different things you want to do async. You want to fetch data and kind of treat it as state. So you can kind of refresh that value. You want to change out the value when you change, so it kind of derives. So if you change the current post ID, you go and fetch the new post, stuff like that. But then you also have, and that's like use async here. And then you have like use action, which is also asynchronous, but it's not about like fetching data. It's not about state. It's about mutations. And they behave, and it took me a long time to kind of, because I tried to make like one primitive that did both, but that doesn't make sense, because just one thing is like, well, maybe we should just look into it. I'm gonna basically just gonna go through documentation and examples here. But then we also have suspense, which is also part of this whole asynchronous story, where React has something called, I didn't know about this until recent. Like suspense is tightly integrated with transitions. And what it's all about is stating that you're transitioning something. So any state change you make during that transition, that's gonna be stale until the asynchronous stuff in that transition is done. So you kind of get, so for example, if I'm changing the ID of the post and I'm showing that ID somewhere, a silly example, I don't want that ID to show until the post is loaded, right? It's about coordinating asynchronous values. Synchronous and asynchronous, actually. That's the thing. It's like suspense isn't only about promises. It's about the synchronous changes you make to apply those asynchronous values. And I was able to get through Ryan Solid. I can't remember his last name. He had this really, really nice, let's see if I can find it. Ryan Shaw, Solid JS. Let's see. Yeah, Ryan Carniato. Where's his the last one? Let's jump into, I want to subscribe to him. Yeah, Async Signals. And it's like a 6-hour stream, but it's really, really good because it goes into this whole concept of how do we want to manage asynchronous values in UIs. And it talks about React and how complex React is with the suspense boundaries and the transitions, that you have to express like these transition callbacks. And then for me, it's like just a bunch of indirection. Like you're doing this transition, you're making some state changes, but you don't see how those state changes are connected to the suspense, or how those state values are like affecting each other. It's really, really tricky to read that code, I think. But anyways, and then Svelte did this, and Solid had transitions for a while. But then Svelte did this thing where they just removed the transitions and it just worked. I'm not sure exactly how Svelte does this, like technically, but it seems to be like through the compiler, and I'm not sure how that's gonna work in a global setting. Like if you define like some global state and you want to synchronize that at some component level, I'm not sure how that's going to work. But to the point of like Solid, so the way Solid does this is actually really, really cool. So if you think about Solid, it's this like a reactive graph. So you can think about nodes, right? And then each node represents some state value. And then and it can be like just a signal, it can be a derived, it can be an async, it doesn't matter. It's like, it's a reactive value. And And then these nodes, they have dependencies to each other. So an async node might have a dependency to like a signal node, a synchronous node. And what happens here is like, I should maybe have drawn this up, but I think I'm able. So you have these two nodes, right? Asynchronous, synchronous. This is the post ID. This is the post. So what happens is I go in and I change this node, right, to a new post ID, and it triggers the graph. So the graph goes down and it goes and visits all the things that depend on this post ID. And then it hits the async node and it's gonna fetch the post again, right? So it's gonna trigger asynchronicity, like a new promise, and it's gonna throw back to the synchronous post ID node. And then it kind of stops there. So now the post ID node becomes stale. So when you access it through the UI, it's still going to show the old post ID. Morning, Adam. And only until the actual async node resolves, then it updates the post ID. But this is like low level into the reactive graph. And that means that it's always going to behave this way. And it's going to be implicit. So it might not be obvious to you that how this relationship actually works. Which I really love about Ryan. Like he's a professor, right? He, like, the way he so there's two things. One thing is like he just loves to dive into things and explore and research and try things. But he also has this other professor side to him, which is like just talking about everything he finds, like, to anyone who wants to listen, which is really, really good, which is really amazing. And as he mentioned, like, this is like a very low level implementation that at the higher abstraction creates like behavior, and some of that behavior might be unknown because there's so many scenarios where you're using these signals, right? And combining them in different ways. So as he stated, he doesn't know if this is like the actual way to do it, but it's worth trying, and it's really, really cool. So the way I think about it compared to React is like you can have a nested component that's gonna run a promise, and it's gonna throw up to the suspense component, right? It's the same thing in Solid. It's just that it's in the reactive graph. So you, instead of having a component that renders a child that throws a promise back up, you're gonna have a signal that's being set that's gonna make another signal or reactive primitive trigger because it's observing, and it's gonna throw back up that it's, oh, I'm actually not ready to do this. Okay, all that to say that it was good timing, because I wasn't sure exactly how. I built like asynchronous primitives before, but I've never been like perfectly sure exactly how they should work. So what I thought we could do, well, first of all, so we're gonna change that. So I don't think we're gonna write much code. We're gonna change some examples though. Let's see. But I want to move the, let's see. So I want to move, let's see. No, maybe it should just be like this. Okay, sorry. Okay, so we have these hooks. So we have useState, and the only difference, like with React, is that we're operating with objects, and this has to do with embracing proxies. So for reactivity to work using proxies is to use objects. So you use an object. So there's nothing special with that. And then we have use effect, which is also the same thing, only that it runs synchronously. So this actually runs synchronously when you run it, or when the component mounts. That's the only difference. And the reason is that, well, first of all, we need effects to, like when you change something and the reactivity triggers, you want everything to trigger synchronously. So everything's up to date, right? So the effects, they trigger synchronously. And it's not like React. Like in React, when you when it renders out a component, well, I shouldn't say render, when it intends to commit a component, what do they call it? There's a render phase or commit phase. Anyways, React will first evaluate all the VDOM stuff, kind of like run all the components, but only if they're actually being applied to the DOM, it's going to run the effects, right? So you don't know. So the use effect in React might not even run. And this is all related to suspense. But here it will run. It's guaranteed that it's going to be applied to the DOM, which is nice. Anyways, so it's kind of the same. And then we have use derived, which I guess is kind of like use memo. But I'm using the term derived because this is about, first and foremost, deriving values. So you have two different state values that creates a new value, right? That's what it is. It just happens to cache it and all that stuff. So I guess this is a good example. You have a shopping cart, and then you have the derived. Yeah, let's change that. Use derived. And a lot of these examples are written by AI. I just want to get to a state where we kind of have, like, I'm going broad first, and then we're gonna, what's it called? Quantity, and then we're gonna do quality. Like it's using the term, let's use the term derived here. Derived. Cool. Yes, so that's derived. And then let's jump to the other ones first, so you kind of have a sense of this if you haven't seen it before. And then we have use view. And this is just because, as I said, we have these reactive objects, and to be able to compose them, you can't just spread, because that destructures them and kind of breaks them apart in terms of reactivity. So there's something called use view that just composes objects together without breaking reactivity. But I think it's and it's called, so this should be use counter. So been changing the terminology a little bit, so just make sure we're consistent here. So basically, typically for state management, you create your own hooks, right? And then you compose that into some component, maybe you expose it on the context. But the point is that there's a view that's coming out of that hook, which is a mix of state. You might have some actions. If you had some derived here, you can just put the derived right there and compose them with the state. And it's just a really nice way to compose the internals of something. And also some of it you maybe want to be internal, some of it should be exposed. It's just a really nice composition tool. And then we have the router. And this is also interesting because we were looking at the Inferno, because this is built on top of Inferno. And we were looking at the Inferno router. And one thing that's kind of bothered me, I remember when React first got its React router and everything, I don't like when we use JSX to configure things. Like we have such a nice way of using our state layer, like use state, use effect, and all of this to like define logic. And then suddenly there's been so many clever uses of JSX, which has nothing to do with UI. It's about functionality, right? So then they don't actually render any UI. They're just there to configure things. So a router is an example of that. And I don't like configuring using JSX. I want my JSX to represent my UI. Marco.js. Isn't that what Ryan worked on before Solid? Oh my god. What's this? What is this? What is this? Sorry. Yeah, no. Like I'm in the world where I think at many times I've tried to make how should I put it, multiple, like finding the golden primitive, right? Or that kind of fits everything. But I've come to learn that it's more and more about the combination of primitives that needs to fit together nicely. So as a case in point, like the trying to put JavaScript into HTML, like JavaScript is fine. Like it's that's good. And HTML is good. You just have to create a bridge for them, right? So they can collaborate in a good way. You don't put one into the other. And then you can argue, what about JSX, right? Yeah, I think I got myself on that one. Well, to be fair, it's not actually putting HTML. It's not putting HTML in JavaScript. It's just a different way of describing objects. Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, the JSX story. Oh. Yeah, I have to think about that one a bit more. Why is it okay to put JSX into JavaScript and not put JavaScript into HTML? I guess that's the thing, is right. You're not putting HTML into JavaScript. You're not actually writing. That's the thing. You're not actually writing HTML in JavaScript. It's just syntax that looks like HTML. But I guess we could say the same about Marco. It's like it's not actually. Yeah. What the fuck? Yeah, I have to think about that one. Maybe I'm just creating like from my own preference. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm trying to defend here. It's like home here is just an age. You're calling a function called age, referencing home, and you have an object for the properties. So it's just a nicer way to. It's just syntax for hyperscript. Syntactic sugar for hyperscript. It's not HTML. But it just happens to, and that's the thing, it might produce. So maybe, like, it's not even, it's XML, right? You're putting XML into, I think that's a better way to describe it, because XML is just like a data structure, right? HTML is specifically to render elements in the browser, but JSX isn't about rendering elements in the browser. It can be any target, right? It's just a description. It's a configuration of the UI. Yeah, okay. And that makes it fine. Anyways, yeah, so the router, optionally typed params. Oh, interesting. So like you would maybe have yeah, and you said it's fine. But yeah, user, yeah, so optionally as like you would definitely have a post ID, but you would then like slash maybe something else. I it's not in there now, but I've seen routers do this, right? On the server side, you do like a question mark kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, we could do that. That's possible. But yeah, back to my point is that I don't like describing functionality using JSX. I like describing the user interface. So everything from routing, and as we're going to see with suspend as well, and even error handling, I don't prefer that being JSX. So as you can see with this router, it's just a configuration of routes, and then you treat it as any other state. And it gives you so much flexibility. And there's no special JSX abstraction with like a lot of different properties, and you start putting data fetching in there and everything. You don't have to do that. It's just state, right? That you can combine with anything else. Okay, cool. And then we have use async. Let's see. Oh, my coffee got cold. Okay, so as I mentioned, I've been back and forward on this many times. I built like query primitives versus mutation primitives. How should you expose them? Should you expose them with an object with the state and methods? But that breaks composition because even though if you're using a query, it makes sense to use the term fetch for whatever you're fetching. But for a mutation, it feels weird to call mutate when you just want to run a function, and so on and so on. So this is one of the also not celebrated enough things that React showed to us is how you can destructure. Like destructuring an array, a side effect of that is naming variables, right? It's an amazing thing. So if you have this tuple, you can like name this state. You can name this refresh function, right? Which is amazing. But yes, so let's look at how it does this. So I want to change this example to not have all this. Or maybe it's fine. Yeah, okay, it's fine. Okay, so we have this user ID. We have this use async, and it takes a signal, or it creates a signal, or it creates an abort controller, which means that you get access to the signal. So if, for example, I refresh while this is running, it's gonna trigger immediately. That's important. So how these things behave is also different, right? So if you use async and you're trying to drag down some state, and you refresh while it's trying to drag down that state, you want that new refresh to override the previous one, and you want to cancel the old one, right? That is the behavior you want. And with the signal, you can pass that to fetch or whatever else to kind of abort the thing. But the point is, when it's running, if you run refresh again or the user ID changes, it's gonna get the newest values. You're guaranteed to always have the newest value. Cool. So even if you don't use signal here, it's always going to be the latest value. So basically, when it's running this, you call refresh, it's still going to be running the old one, right? But under the covers, it's not going to actually apply those state changes. Yeah, this is a good example. Yeah, it really, and this is how Solid, this is very much inspired by Solid. They have this use async that just fetches a promise, and if you're using any other state in there, it's just going to rerun like a derived. It's a derived asynchronous value. That's really what it is. But there's a lot of complexity to this. So unlike a normal synchronous state value, you have kind of 3 states. Well, you have many more states than that. But yeah, so you have many states. You don't have the value. Like a synchronous value has 1 state, the value. But an asynchronous value has the initial loading of that value. That's 1 state. And in that state, it doesn't have a value yet. It's just loading the value. And then if that's successful, it's in an idle state or like a value state, right? It's not loading anything, but it's in a value state. But then you might be refreshing that value. So you're in a stale value state while it's refreshing. And then you have 2 different error states. You might have an error when you're loading the initial value, but you might also have an error while you're refreshing the value. So it's like, it's crazy complex. And the question is, how do you want to hide that complexity, and how would you hide that complexity? So this is the thing I'm still like not wrestling with, but there has to be a clear decision. So to take Solid as an example again, or even, yeah, let's talk about React first. So the way React does this is you would use the promise, right? And then it will throw to suspense. And if it resolves, it's going to render as normal. And if it, rejects, it's going to go to the arrow boundary. So you depend on suspense and arrow boundaries somewhere else. Like, and this is the indirection I don't like. You're looking at this component, it's fetching some data. You have no idea how your UI is going to be affected by that, looking at the component code. That's the indirection. But what do you do if you want to refresh that value? You can't do that in React, like using the primitives of React, because you have to apply a new promise, and that's going to go to the suspense boundary, and the suspense boundary is going to trigger again, except if you're using a transition, maybe that's what transitions are for. Yeah, I think that's what transitions are meant to be. But I'm actually not sure how they work, React transitions. Maybe they have like a good example. So start transition. So it's setting a tab. Yeah, so I think it's the same thing. Like if you think about the reactive graph versus the component graph, I guess it's not a graph. Well, everything's a graph. Isn't that the thing? Even a tree is a graph or something, whatever. So it's setting the next tab here, right? But setting that tab is going to render a new component tree, right? But that component tree might throw a promise. So it's not going to apply it yet, right? It's kind of like pending. So it's not throwing to a suspense boundary. It's just not being applied until it's ready. That's basically it. And this is the thing I learned from Ryan. It's like that mental model of, okay, you're applying something synchronously, but applying that thing synchronously is going to trigger something async. And that async thing is going to throw back and then prevent that state transition from happening from its root, which the root here is the next tab, which leads to something else, right? Yeah. Anyways, where were we? To pop up an error. Because sometimes you might want a global mechanism to pop up an error. Yeah. Yeah, so if you want to deal, yeah, so this is the thing, right? How do you want to deal with the error? We can talk about that. And then the question is like, does your mechanism force you to handle it in a specific way, or does it give you the flexibility to choose how you want to handle it? But one thing that's important here, which was a design decision, is that since asynchronous values doesn't have a single loading state, they have two loading states. They have the initial loading and then they have the refreshing state. So you want to differentiate the errors as well. So that is why the use async state, you need to check the error first, which is really a good practice. Because if it's erroring in is loading, it's going to stay in is loading with that error. And if it errors in is refreshing, it's going to stay in is refreshing with the error. So you can actually choose what you want to do here. So user.error, and I'm going to actually change this. Use async. Was this the thing? Yeah. So user is loading and user error. That's the thing I want to check. So if the user doesn't load at all in the first place, I want to treat it here. But if for some reason it errored during refresh, I might want to show something like out of sync or something. Yeah, exactly. So if you want to do something, maybe you don't want to yeah, the question is like, what do you want to do about the UI? Yeah, so just to show an example. So what I would do, like if you have this like global notifications handler, so you don't want to actually show the error in the page. So what you could do is you could choose to not return anything, but you could just create an effect, right? So if user.isLoading and user.error, and you would have like some global notification error, notify error. Like you could just use an effect for that. But you also have to choose what do you want to do with the UI. Or you could also throw user.error here, and it will be caught in the error boundary. That's also possible. One thing I don't like about, yeah, we'll get to that. There's one thing I don't like how it technically works, and that is the error boundary. Ideally, that would be more low-level integration, but that's not possible in Inferno. But yeah, those are like the options you have. Because even if you notify something globally, you have to choose what to do about the UI. So I actually do like, I like this better. Because the problem with an error boundary is that, well, the problem with the error boundary in this implementation is that it's gonna unmount everything when it gets an error. It's gonna unmount everything, and I don't think that's true for React and Solid. Their error boundary keeps kind of the UI around in the background, like the state of the UI is still there. So that when you resolve that error, which is like super beautiful in Solid, it's like you just rerun the signal, which is kind of crazy. It's really, really cool. So if like a promise signal, I'm going to call it a promise signal. If a promise signal rejects, you can catch that, and then you can rerun the promise signal. And that's just going to update that value, and it's going to apply the UI again. Yeah, you can do error boundary with CSS. So you have both of them there. I actually think that's a better solution, because you don't unmount everything else. But the thing about like throwing here, it's not like tightly integrated. What's going to happen is you're throwing, and this component is going to go up the context and notify about the error. And then the component with the error boundary is going to like re-render again. So if the error happens on the first, like say you're loading up a component and some child is throwing an error, it's actually going to try to load up the component first and put it into the DOM. And then the error is thrown. Which is going to return null. The component is going to return null. Inferno is going to like apply it to the DOM, which is kind of nothing. Well, it depends, right, where the error happens. If it's like 10 levels deep, it might actually, like there's a risk that you actually see something. And then it throws the error and it renders it again. But now it's going to render it as an error. So that's what I don't quite like about this implementation of error boundary. But it makes me, yeah, we should talk more about it, because there's a lot of assumptions about how things should work, like suspense, that doesn't necessarily make sense. So there's like so much room to kind of rethink things. Like, is error boundary a good experience, user experience? So for example, in the Divergent to-dos app, like here in this app, it's actually gonna, the whole app is just gonna break down, right? If any error occurs, you don't see anything, you can just give feedback, and that's it, right? I don't think they have component did catch in Inferno. Did they implement that? No. No, it's only referencing React. Yeah, so, but it's interesting how you want to deal with errors. One thing, so just to kind of give a different example, so you would never, at the point where the error happens, you would decide what's going to happen to this piece of UI that actually requires the value, and for some reason it errors, right? So you choose what you want to do with that piece of UI. So you can either show an actual, let's see. Oh. So you can actually show like, there we have it. So you can show a specific error in that piece of UI that requires the value, Or you could do like an effect that's going to notify something global, and you choose to not render anything. Yeah. Anyways, we're gonna get back to that with the suspense thing. Where are we? Okay. Yes. So it has automatic dependency tracking. So if whenever the query changes here, it's gonna abort the current query and it's gonna run the new query. So you're guaranteed to have the latest value at any point, which is nice. Where does it use refresh here? I don't think it does. What's this filter? Filter all. Is it using the filter anywhere? No. Okay, cool. I'm not sure why it has the filter when it's not doing anything about it. Anyways, yeah, so the point is, but you might want to debounce this, right? Yeah, that's also a question. Like, how would you... Because that's also an example in React. I think this is a different kind of asynchronous issue. No, that's fine. Okay, so what's interesting about this is, like, if you wanted to debounce this, well, first of all, you would kind of choose... yeah, this is interesting. I haven't thought about this. So what if you wanted a debounce search where it keeps the latest value at all times, right? So if you just debounce from the outside, it would still resolve... how should I put this? Yeah, so if you start typing, this is interesting. So you start typing, and then the debounce triggers and starts fetching. But then you start typing again, and now the other value is going to resolve in the UI while you're typing because you're debouncing from the outside. So what you really want to do is you want to debounce from the inside, so that if you're typing, you're getting into this request, and then if you don't have a query, or you need a number of characters to actually start the fetch, that's fine. But then you want to also have a debouncer in there. So you don't want to debounce. How would that work? How would that work? Oh my god, asynchronous stuff. So the point is that you don't return the fetch, you return the debounce of the fetch. So that when it actually yeah, you return a debounce of the fetch, I think. No. No, you can debounce from the outside. Yeah, sorry. So the point is, okay, back to the example. I haven't thought about this, and this is complex stuff. So you're typing, and then you stop typing. It triggers the fetch, right? But then as it's fetching, you're yeah. No, it makes sense. Yeah. I need to write actual code. Oh my god. Yeah. Isn't that the story always with debounce? So we are typing, and every time we type, we get into this thing, right? So if state.query is nothing, we're gonna return nothing. That's fine. And then we're actually gonna query on each character just for. But what we're gonna do is that we have this debouncer, right? So we created like const debounce, debounce, whatever. Create debouncer, like 300 milliseconds or something. And then what we're gonna do inside here is that we're gonna debounce this fetching. Something like that, right? But the point is, if signal aborted, we're just gonna return. So the behavior you're gonna get here is, as we're typing, it's gonna be calling this all the time, right? But it's debouncing it. Which means that it returns a promise that's gonna fire. Well, but when you debounce, you're ignoring the previous ones. Yeah, no, this is not gonna work. How would you do this? Maybe that's why React has its own primitive for it. This is complex. Because you really want it to be bound to the signal. Okay, anyways, let's just imagine like you have used debounce or something. 300. And then we're going to return debounce. And then we're going to pass it a signal. So the point is, as you're typing, you are postponing the fetch, right? But you also want to cancel the previous ones, which is why you need to give it the signal. So that the debouncer will then abort the previous signal, nothing happens. It doesn't even call the fetch, it just returns nothing, it doesn't apply any state changes, nothing. And then you 300 milliseconds pass since you last typed. It's gonna run this one. But while you're doing that, you start typing again. And what's gonna happen now is that the signal has been aborted again. And it's gonna work. So you're not gonna see that stale value in the UI. But this is interesting. It's almost like use async could have a debounce parameter. Yeah, this is too tricky to even reason about on your own. Because you can imagine if you just had this, and you could say like 300 or like debounce 300, like that's something you can understand. It's gonna wait 300 milliseconds and then run the last one. Yeah. Interesting. Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked like crazy here. The whole point was that we have use async, and then we have it reruns when you change the state. Oh, sorry, it had a filter here. Okay, sorry. So if you change the query or you change the filter, it's going to refresh this, and it's going to use the last value. So it doesn't matter if you're typing or if you're changing the filter after you've been typing and it's not fetched the previous value yet, it's going to cancel that out and always use the latest value. That's the important part. And that should just work with an async primitive. That was really my conclusion. And then you're able to manually refresh that value if you want to do that, either like through the UI or if there's some other mechanism that requires it to refresh, which could be like an async action. Yes, and as I mentioned, there are like hard errors and soft errors. Hard errors being error on the initial value. Soft errors are errors on the refreshes. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and you get the signal, blah, 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 blah. Okay, cool. So that's like, you need a primitive for fetching asynchronous state. You want to use it as state. But then you have other asynchronous operations, which is like typically changing state on the server, which is a different ball game. Because here, first of all, you want to have params, right? You want to be able to send this action some params that you want to pass to the server. Additionally, you don't want this scope to be reactive, right? That doesn't make any sense, that the action runs automatically when it's using some state. So here we can see we're going to create a to-do, and it's like what you expect. And you have the function for running the action, but then you also have the state of creating the to-do. So you can track that state that it's creating, and then you also have all the executions. I'm not sure if I want to call it actions. Maybe it should be called pending or something. It's the pending executions of the action. So it's not like multiple actions. It's just the queued operations. Because this is different as well. Like use async, every time you call like refresh or it reacts to a change, it's going to override the previous execution. But that's not true for an action. For an action, you want to queue them. So I'm going to create a to-do, and I want to create another to-do, but I want to queue that behind the first to-do. And the reason you want to do this is for consistency. So you could imagine like you would want to just create multiple to-dos, right? Don't wait for the previous one, just create them. But now you risk not having consistency. For example, if there was something, there was a dependency between them, maybe on the server or something. But more importantly, if you want to create a to-do, and then you want to use revalidation. So after you add the to-do, you go and you refresh the to-dos list, right? That needs to finish before you can execute the next to-do or next create to-do. So it just creates consistency. So that's built in. So you can create, yeah, and I guess then it doesn't even make sense to have actions because it's going to execute, well, sorry, you can still see the pending actions, of course, but it's only going to execute one of them at a time. Yes, so that's action. Yeah, a bunch of examples here. Queue management. Yeah, it's a really nice primitive. Yeah, and another thing, I'm not sure if we can actually see that here. So these actions, they actually have retry and cancellation built into them. So when you iterate, maybe we can see, yeah, we can see it here. So you have these pending actions, right? And what you can do is, if one of them fails, you have the ability to retry it. So it's just going to take the same params, run the action again, basically try again. Or you can cancel the action, and it's going to be popped off the queue, the state updates, and then it processes the next thing. And this is just super nice to have built in, because this is very complex state management. I can't remember if we need to check that. I can't remember if the queue continues on error. I don't think it should do that. Yeah, that's a question. But this is the tricky part of building these asynchronous primitives, is that there's a balance between taking care of the state management that's very complex to do on your own, but not take care of too much to dictate how you're gonna apply this stuff. So there's like a very fine line. Okay, cool. But then we have use suspend, and this is really interesting. So unlike the other solutions like React, which has suspend with transitions, and Solid and Svelte, which has kind of suspend without transitions, but they infer transitions by the dependency graph, this doesn't do any of that. It just explicitly gives you the opportunity to synchronize values. So what's going to happen here is you're going to use suspend, and for each of the keys, you're going to return some state. It can be some synchronous state, and it can be one or multiple asynchronous states. So what's going to happen here is, this is where I think maybe the examples don't quite catch it. But this is an example where you have a user ID, and when you change that user ID, you want to go and grab the user and you want to grab the posts. But you don't want to show either or until both of them are done, right? So there you can see we have a user ID. I'm fetching a user. I'm fetching the posts of the user. And then I suspend both of them. But I can still access user ID if I want to do that. Or I can access the raw user or the raw posts being fetched. But this just is kind of like a promise all. This is just when all of them are done, I want to display it. And I can check the reduced state of them. Like, does any of them have an error? Are we still loading? Like the initial load, is it refreshing? Do we have refreshing? Yeah, of course we have refreshing. So this is the initial load. And the point is, when you get to this point, you know that you have both of them. And this is also reflected in the typing, which is really, really nice. So when you consume user or posts, they can be in any state. You don't know. So you have to check that in the UI. But when you put them behind suspend, you can just check the state of the suspend. And then you will have resolved values here. And you can still check if you called like refresh on any of these. The suspend is going to move into a refreshing state, and you can also check that if what you're seeing is kind of out of or about to be updated. But the thing that's even more interesting, yeah, I guess we can see it here. Yeah, so this is what I think is wrong in this example, and we can fix it. So we have the same thing here. We have a region, we have a period, and we have users and sales, and then we're suspending users and sales, which is fine. Yeah, here we have refreshing, so we can show that it's updating. But the thing is that these values are going to immediately change. So when I change the region, you're going to see the region change immediately. And then you're going to see this updating thing. which is, yeah, maybe that's fine. And you can do that if you want to do that. But what we could also do, we could put the actual filters into the suspense. So when you change the region, for example, it's gonna keep the old region. So you're choosing the new region, but in the suspense, it's gonna be the old region until the actual new regions has loaded. Okay? So in the UI, you're gonna click the new region, and you can still see updating if you want to have that, but the actual selection of the region doesn't happen until the data has resolved. And this is the thing that hard coded into like Svelte and Solid. They make this like, this is how it works. So if a state value happens to be consumed by something asynchronous, that state value isn't going to change until the dependent async values are resolved. Or you can go and you can use this special eager thing to go and grab the actual latest value of the filter. But here you don't do that by something magical. You just, if you want to know the actual state of filters or the region, you go and point to filters region. That will always be the latest value. But if you put it behind suspend, it's going to be the latest value related to the other asynchronous values. So you kind of have like a snapshot, an asynchronous snapshot, where all the values make sense related to each other. And I think that's really, really cool that you can control it at that level. And you can see it when you read it, right? It's not implicit behavior. It's very much explicit. Because you can ask the question like, is it the experience you actually want? And sometimes it is, especially when you want to synchronize multiple asynchronous sources. That's definitely something you want to do. But do you really want to force synchronous values to become stale just because something asynchronous depends on them? I think that's too strong of an opinion. But again, as I said, they can like make you use this like magical eager thing to actually show the eager value. So maybe that's fine to do it that way. Yeah, it's really interesting. But we can't like implement. So this API is kind of driven by a restriction, really, because in Inferno we can't really implement suspense. But suspense is indirection. It's like you have a suspense boundary over here, you have a transition over here that changes something over here that's being used by something over here, and this is where I'm using it over here. It's like you have 5 points to reason about, completely decoupled, which is not fun. While here you have them more like these states could live somewhere else, right? The filter, the users, the sales, that could be somewhere else. But explicitly in this component, you're saying suspend these values. So you might be using the region synchronously somewhere else, if that makes sense. But in this UI experience, I want them to be synced together. And that explicitness, I think, has value. Anyways, yeah, I was going to rewrite some of the examples here. But yeah, it was nice talking through it because there's a couple of things. Yeah, especially the action queue. Yeah, because I think, what if you have like an increment action, right? So you're calling just increment. Um, yeah, it just depends on the previous action. I think it's important. So I'm gonna make sure it works that way, that it does one at a time, and if it one errors, it's actually gonna stop. Yeah, cool. I guess that's it. Maybe this was a lot of talking, but it was nice like talking through it. So I'm gonna fix the last stuff and publish this, and then yeah, and then it's the error boundary. I'm gonna reflect on that one a bit more as well. as well. Yeah, because the thing is, like, what if you have a nested component? So you can imagine you have an error boundary. You have like 10 components down, and then it renders fine on the first round, right? It's still loading the data for some nested component. And then an error happens when like level 5 deep component, the promise resolves, and it's an error. And then it throws that error up, and then it replaces the whole UI, right? So you kind of see the UI down to that component that's loading something, and then the UI is gone because you threw to the error boundary. So an error boundary makes sense to me when the error occurs when you're rendering, right? When you're doing that initial render, because then you can just not show anything immediately. But this is not the case, right? You don't have synchronous errors, you have asynchronous errors. So to me, it's really weird. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess that's the thing. It's like, even though Inferno doesn't handle the synchronous rendering ideally, because it's going to try rendering it, and then the component that fails is going to return null, and then it flips to the error state. It's going to work perfectly fine for any updates. So you kind of render initially, and then something bad happens, and that is the case, right? I can't imagine, like, if you have a synchronous error, you have like a proper bug in your code. While async errors, that's like, can be any reason for that happening. But what I meant, but in that context, like, why have an error boundary? If you're trying to display something, it's in its initial render, right? And then something asynchronous is happening, and then something goes bad. Like, you're showing a loading indication somewhere, and something goes bad. Like, why do you want to remove higher up UI? You just want to replace your loading. That's why I didn't understand suspense. Why doesn't suspense have an error property? Because at the point of loading, that's where you want to show your error, right? So yeah, I think yeah, I want to question that. Like, why have an error boundary for synchronous renders? Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. If you have a synchronous render error, something is really bad in your code, because that should be reliable. But it's the asynchronous errors you want to deal with. But those asynchronous errors are also tied to the loading state, right? So at the point of the loading state, that's where you want to handle your error. And then, yeah. Yeah, okay. That's my final thoughts for now on that. And then I'm gonna, yeah, as I said, I'm gonna prep this and publish it. And then I think we need to, yeah, I'm not sure what's gonna happen after that. I'm noticing I'm trying to refactor Divergent to do it. And it's a little bit, I'm not like super pumped about it because it's a very complex project and it's very overwhelming. But I think I found one way to deal with it so that we can actually have something on the screen, and then we can like refactor it step by step and actually see something on the screen. Because just refactoring the code, it's going to be just hell. But yeah, it's going to be super nice to have these primitives in there before we get going with that. Cool. Okay. That's it for me for now. And then thanks for watching. Yep. Bye.